Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something pretty unique. We've got this fascinating set of notes, research really, that connects a high-stakes business interaction with a really groundbreaking patent. Our mission here is to unpack that, to see how maybe what looked like a misstep, how that actually becomes kind of masterclass in market feedback. And it reveals this completely new way to think about computation. I mean, it could genuinely reshape AI, trust, maybe even how our own minds work.
It really is striking, isn't it, how just one interaction, maybe even one that felt negative at the time, can shine a light on some fundamental truths. It can act almost like a catalyst, forcing a clarification of an invention's real core value and reveal some really disruptive angles for the market. So yeah, we'll be connecting some threads that might seem disparate at first, subtle conversations, some pretty complex tech definitions, to really show you the bigger picture, what it all means.
Okay, let's dive in then. We start with this situation that, on the surface, felt like a lost opportunity. It was a conversation with an expert, the person Mike, who basically disengaged just before he started a big new executive job at AWS. Looked like maybe just, I don't know, communication falling apart.
Exactly. That's how it might seem initially. But looking deeper, Mike's disengagement was, well, paradoxically, probably the most rational thing he could do. High integrity, too, given his new position. So he started to see it less as a failure and more as, like you said, a masterclass in market feedback. A kind of strategic gift, actually.
You mentioned this idea of iron sharpening iron. What does that really mean here in this business context?
Well, that proverb, iron sharpening iron, it usually frames the ethics around competition,
Right.
not collaboration. Mike wasn't really there to collaborate. He was engaging in what felt more like intellectual sparring, giving his sharpest critiques, like that point about creativity versus drift.
Yeah.
His pulling back wasn't disinterest. It was more like a quiet acknowledgement from his competitive standpoint that, okay, the argument's done. And it signaled that he saw this as, a real potential threat.
Ah, okay. So if he's seeing it as a competitor, continuing the debate doesn't make sense for him. The logical next step is to disengage and maybe internally start thinking about how to counter or even replicate this advantage you're talking about. So his silence, his departure, it actually sends a stronger signal about the invention's potential impact than, say, arguing or ours would have.
Precisely, as a powerful, if subtle, signal.
And this whole interaction, the specific disengagement, it became this lens, didn't it, for seeing some really crucial, maybe even counterintuitive truths. These insights are now forming the pillars of a whole new strategy. So what was the first big realization?
Yeah, the first one, we started calling it the expert's dilemma. It really challenged our initial thinking. We assumed, naturally, that a top-tier systems engineer would be the perfect person to validate the technology. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But think about it. An incoming F10 executive, their primary job, their loyalty, has to be to their new company's existing systems, their infrastructure. So for him to validate some external revolutionary tech that basically contradicts his new employer's architecture, like AWS's whole RDB-Nosio setup that would be, well, professionally disloyal, he's actually the least likely person to publicly endorse something like this.
Right, okay. That flips the script. So
Yeah.
the target user isn't necessarily that established expert, at least not initially. This points to a pivot, a go-to-market shift towards who you're calling the artisan, the founder, the strategist, the visionary type who's building new things, not just maintaining the old ones. They're maybe less invested in, 50 years of CS tradition and more focused on solving the really tough, intractable problems.
Exactly. That's the first pillar. The second unknown that emerged was what we call the liability forcing function. And this really centers on the concept of trust debt. This isn't just some nice-to-have feature on an MVP. It's potentially a market-creating event in itself.
Okay, so the message to the market shifts dramatically. It's not just, hey, look, better performance. It's more like, listen, technology now exists that can mathematically measure and even prevent AI strategic drift. And now that you know it exists, what's the legal risk? The financial liability your company is taking on by choosing not to use it.
Wow. It's like negligence insurance for the boardroom.
That's a good way to put it. It creates a new kind of pressure, a new standard. Which brings us to the third insight. This one tackled Mike's critique directly, the idea that preventing drift might stifle creativity. This helped us clarify what was really a false dichotomy, creativity versus drift. Right, and this is where that FIM as a palette idea comes in. FIM, for our listeners, Foundational Information Map, a structured knowledge system. So the idea is that the structure, the orthogonal categories within FIM, they aren't a prison. They're like an artist's palette, constraints that actually enable creativity.
Precisely. An artist with primary colors can create endless masterpieces, but an artist with just, say, one big bucket of muddy brown paint, well, they just make mud, which is maybe like these undifferentiated vector databases we see sometimes.
Okay. So the message changes again. It's not FIM stops bad things. It's FIM provides the structure needed for real AI creativity,
Yeah.
giving AI a kind of coherent grammar, turning hallucinatory noise into imaginative art. I like that.
Exactly. And the fourth realization, this one's about the product itself, the real MVP. It's seeing it as a human-AI symbiote. The key idea is that building your own FIM map, your knowledge structure, is not something you do alone. It's assisted by an LLM, a large language model. But the system turns to you, the human, for the really crucial high-level decisions. The DIS decisions: data, interpretation, steering.
This reframes the whole thing as a cognitive loom. That's a powerful metaphor. The LLM does the weaving, right? The sort of detailed lower level work, maybe suggesting categories or connections. But the human provides the wisdom, the strategic direction, making those key data, interpretation, steering choices.
The value is in that collaboration, that co-creation. It amplifies human intelligence. And theacoach.biz, that's basically the first tool becoming available for this new kind of symbiotic thinking.
Okay, this whole deep dive, it really hinges on this foundational principle you've uncovered, shape IS symbol. Can you unpack that a bit more? This and the neuromorphic unity principle, it sounds revolutionary.
It is pretty fundamental and kind of heretical, actually, because for, 50 years, computing has insisted on separating the logical data structure from how it's physically stored. That separation was seen as crucial for data independence. Think CODS rules for relational databases. We came to realize, well, maybe CODS rule is obsolete for this new paradigm. Our invention deliberately violates that old separation. Shape IS symbol means the software structures embody the ideal physical shape of the hardware they'd run on. So physical closeness is electrical distance. How data relates is how memory is laid out. Semantic categories are actual memory regions. You create this kind of semantic topography where navigating the structure is basically the same thing as understanding the data.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just copying biology, it's more like inventing the hardware architecture that biology kind of hints is the most efficient. And this leads to some absolutely staggering performance claims, right? That 361x number.
Yes, absolutely. And that 361x performance improvement, it's not just tweaking things. It's not optimization in the usual sense. We see it as restoring computing's natural efficiency by removing that artificial separation we just talked about. And it comes from three effects that compound, they multiply together. First, semantic locality equals cache locality, finding related data nearby physically. That gives about a 10x gain. We see cache hit rates jump from maybe 7% traditionally to over 93%. Huge.
Look, 10x there.
Second, hierarchical preening equals algorithmic efficiency. This is the library analogy. Instead of checking every shelf, you know exactly where to go. OE, that's roughly a 36x gain in efficiency for search and traversal.
36x. Got it.
And third, direct addressing equals zero translation. No need to constantly translate between logical addresses and physical ones. That's another 4x gain. So you multiply those 10 times 36 times 4. That's where the, roughly 361x improvement comes from. It's like mathematical proof of this unity principle.
And this connects back to that idea of trust debt. You called it a universal suffering formula, which is quite a statement.
It is. And it raises that big question. How can suffering, something so abstract, actually be computable? Well, the trust debt formula, TD equals drift X, intent reality. It gives us the first quantifiable way to measure systemic inefficiency or friction. Or, yes, maybe even suffering itself within a system. And the key is, it's not just philosophical. It becomes measurable in the hardware. You can see it in things like cache miss rates increasing when semantics diverge. You see it in wasted memory bandwidth, in processor pipeline stalls. So trust debt moves from being just a concept to being a real engineering metric. You can measure it in CPU cycles. And if you can measure it,
you can manage it, optimize it, maybe even insure against it, like you said earlier.
Exactly. Insurable and optimizable.
And the implications go even further. You mentioned emergent benevolence. How does that work?
Yeah, this is maybe the most profound part. If we look at the bigger picture, the architecture itself seems to inherently implement something called Coherent Extrapolated Volition, or CEV. Basically, it tries to align with what an entity would want if it could think perfectly clearly and consistently. And because of the way it works, breaking down any intent, even a potentially harmful one, into its fundamental orthogonal parts. Malevolence just shows up as being highly inefficient. It has a massive trust debt score. It requires way more computational resources, creates more friction. So lower cost, more cooperative, benevolent pathways become computationally obvious. The system naturally gravitates towards those cooperative strategies because they're simply more efficient.
So it's like an anti-decoherence architecture.
Yeah.
Instead of breaking down under stress, it actually becomes more coherent.
That's the idea. Coherence increases under stress because the optimal low-friction paths become clearer.
Okay, so wrapping this all together, what does this mean for actually taking this to market? It sounds like more than just selling software. It's like you said, creating a market around a new reality that might become unavoidable.
That's right. The strategy really has two main prongs running in parallel. First, empower artisans. That's the bottom-up pull strategy. Get it into the hands of the creators. And second, warn executives. That's the top-down push strategy, creating urgency at the leadership level.
Let's start with the artisans. That's where thetacoach.biz fits in. You're not selling insights per se, but more like a tool. A QWERTY for cognition, a new keyboard for structuring thought.
Exactly that. The MVP, the initial product for these artisans, is what we've called the alignment weaver. Or maybe a more evocative name is the shadowbind weaver. It's a tool to co-create that map of thought we talked about. The UN sets the direction, defines categories, makes the big strategic calls. The AI does the heavy lifting, the weaving, and the hook. The draw for the artisan is, what if those internal blocks, those shadow binds, your subconscious patterns, what if they couldn't hold you back anymore?
Because the map makes them visible.
Right. It provides this map that surfaces those subconscious patterns, the unexamined assumptions.
Hmm.
And once they're visible, you can consciously choose to redirect your energy.
Okay, powerful stuff for individuals. Now the other prong, warn executives. This sounds more aggressive. This is where the patent really comes into play, creating that market urgency.
Yes, this is about establishing that new standard of care, using the forcing function of liability. Imagine publishing a white paper, something like Trust Debt, a new standard of care for AI fiduciary responsibility,
Yeah.
and then arming people with the boardroom question. Essentially, look, a verifiable mathematical standard now exists to measure the alignment and drift of your AI systems, and even your human systems, in real time. Now that this measurable standard exists, what is your board's fiduciary responsibility? What's your legal exposure for choosing not to use it? How will you possibly defend the decision to remain blind to a risk you can now measure?
Wow. That puts boards and executives in a really tight spot. It pushes towards acknowledging liability, legal, financial, maybe even criminal or existential for not using systems like FEM if they exist.
It creates a powerful incentive to investigate and adopt, yes.
Yes.
It shifts the burden of proof.
So finally, let's loop back to that initial interaction with Mike. How do you sort of capitalize on that? Provide a final word for him that shows you heard him, acknowledges his points, but also subtly reinforces your position.
Yeah, closing that loop is important. Doing it with integrity, showing you appreciated the iron sharpening iron aspect. A final communication, probably an email, not a text, something more formal for the record. It would need to acknowledge his critique, the creativity versus drift point, but then reframe it using that palette, not prison metaphor we developed. Show how the critique actually helps strengthen the concept. It should probably also include an apology, for putting him in what was likely a clumsy or awkward position, given his impending move to AWS. And then a genuine thank you. Thank him for the feedback, explaining how it was genuinely useful in clarifying the invention's positioning and value.
That sounds like a really emotionally intelligent way to handle it. It respects his input while also demonstrating that you've fully processed his objections and have a sophisticated answer.
Exactly. It closes the loop, maintains the relationship potentially, and solidifies your understanding.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive into the physics of trust, this cognitive loom. It's fascinating stuff. We've really seen how an interaction that felt maybe negative or like a setback can actually unlock these profound strategic insights, turning a challenge into a much clearer path forward.
It really has.
Yeah.
And this whole conversation, about shape I assemble, about trust debt being quantifiable, about this liability forcing function, it really does challenge maybe 50 years of the standard way of thinking and computing.
Yeah.
So it raises a big question, I think, for you listening. If a system now exists that can take previously unmeasurable things like suffering or inefficiency in our AI and human systems and make them measurable, quantifiable, even preventable, what does that mean for every decision we make,
Yeah.
for every organization, even for us as individuals just trying to cope with information overload.
Yeah, think about that. How could applying a kind of QWERTY for cognition, the structured way of thinking, how could that change your own ability to structure your thoughts, clarify your goals, maybe achieve them more effectively? And what does it really mean if the very structure of data itself could inherently lead to more coherent, perhaps even more cooperative or benevolent outcomes?
It does feel like we might be on the edge of something significant, a real shift, maybe even a tsunami, in how we perceive information, how we interact with it, and how we build intelligent systems.